Hey, so in this tutorial, we're going to start playing with the graphics objects that are available, or some of the graphics objects that are available to you via .NET and C# using WinForms. And what we're going to do is create a little app that allows the user to input some information, and then according to that information, we will basically draw some lines using the graphics API built into C#.NET. You'll kind of see this come together in a little bit. We'll make some patterns that can be pretty fun. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, and I'm just going to call it lines for now. Okay. Now the idea is we're going to solicit the user to input several different pieces of information. The number of lines they want to draw, um, the length of each line that they want to draw, an angle so that basically every time a line is drawn, we'll add that angle and then draw another line. So basically, we'll end up making some really cool patterns depending on what input we provide, that sort of thing. And then also, we'll give the user the ability to increment each line by a certain static value. So let's jump right in. On the left, again, we have our toolbox. On the right, over here, we have our properties that we can mess with the form. And let's start off with something simple and just rename our form to something a little more descriptive. We'll say fun with line patterns. We'll call that. You'll notice when we do that, it changes the property of the window. I'm also going to remove the icon. So there's a show icon property. You can either hit the drop down or you can double click to remove it or to toggle that setting and set it to false. I'm also going to change the start position to the center of my screen just because it'll always show up in the same spot. Now, if we run this, very simply, we get nothing exciting, right? Fun with line patterns. We can maximize it, which is fine. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Um, and then now we can really start kind of diving into the form itself and adding some really cool components that we can then use to implement our pattern drawing. So in the toolbox, there are lots of different things, lots of different controls, but we're going to go with two different panels. One panel is going to be our canvas where we draw, and the other is going to be a panel to hold our controls. Now, panels are useful when you begin trying to think about resizing your application using the maximize, or if you allow users to resize the application so that scaling and the where components and controls sit on your WinForm actually land. So what we're going to do is we're going to dock these inside of the parent container. Now, you can do that with almost every control. You can dock it inside of a parent container simply by clicking the control. And then if you find the dock property over here in the properties, you can either dock it to the left, to the top, to the right, to the bottom, or to the entire parent container. For this project, we're going to dock this particular panel to the top. And you'll notice that it starts, or I'm sorry, it basically snaps in up here. It's docked to the top. For the bottom panel, we're going to dock it to basically the rest of the parent container. So I'm going to choose this center option right here. Now what you're going to get um, when we start messing with this is you'll get better reaction when you scale the application. And by scale it, I mean make it change the size of the window itself. So let's change the background color here on this control, just so we can differentiate between the two areas. And let's make our canvas white. Background color, let's go white. That'll work. Um, Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and rename this instance of our panel here as well, because we're going to be referencing this later when we start trying to do some things. Um, okay, now the inputs that we need, we're going to use text box and labels. So I will go ahead and do the labels first. Let's go ahead and you can either drag and drop or you can double click. I'm going to go ahead and change the color to white, and I'm going to make it a little bit, let's say bold, maybe a little bit bigger. And here we can actually add our text, right? So I'm going to say we need to get from the user the number of lines. All right. And then what I'm going to do, since I've kind of formatted this how I like it, I'm going to basically paste it over several times. So number of lines, we'll also want to get an angle. We'll want to get a length of the line for the line. And then we'll also want to get an increment. I think that's all we need. Okay, so, excuse me. So these are going to be labels for our text box that we're going to use. And I'm just going to kind of space these out a little bit up here. And then let's go get a couple text boxes, okay? So we're going to put these text boxes right up here in line. The number of lines, let's set that to a default of 100. And I'm also going to mess with some of the properties here. We're going to align it to the right, since we're going to be doing numbers here. Um, and I'm also going to change the name of the instance of this text box to call it line number. Or actually, we'll do it the other way so it's a little more intuitive. Number of lines. Okay, and I'm going to copy and paste this guy as well. We'll call this angle. Oops. We'll call this guy length. And then we'll call this guy increment. Okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to scoot all this stuff over and kind of line it up so we get some even spacing and we have room for a button there at the end. So Visual Studio gives you these great, alignment features where you can space things evenly, align them, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to align all these, and then I'm going to make their spacing, their horizontal spacing, even, so that it looks nice and pretty. The last thing I'm going to do, or one more thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to add a button here at the end that simply just says go. And I'm going to make that button a little bit smaller, and I'll just put it up here. And actually what we can do is we can spread it all out evenly across the entire area of our forms right now. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to slide this guy up just a little bit more. So now we have basically an area of our form where we can take input from the user that will control the way that we draw our lines down here on this canvas that we created. For the angle, let's put something that might give us something interesting. The length, let's start at 5. And for the increment, we'll default to 1. Okay. All right, so now we have everything we need. If we ran this right now, it wouldn't do a whole lot, right? Come on. It just looks like basically what we've created. If we maximize this, oops, if we maximize this, everything sort of stays together, right? Kind of how we would want it to be. But if we hit go, it doesn't do anything because then we haven't told it anything to do yet. Okay. So next thing, let's begin to think about some of the pieces we might need to kind of affect where we want to go. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to define the center point of our canvas. And then according to the number of lines, the angle, the length, and the increment, we're going to draw a line according to the angle and according to the length. And so what will end up happening is if we say we want to draw 100 lines and we had, say, 90 degrees in here, we would draw a line, then we'd go 90 degrees, we draw another line, 90 degrees, draw another line, 90 degrees, and you see 100 times. You get the picture. So we come up with some interesting pattern. Okay, so to do this, though, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to override an event that is kind of native to all components or controls in WinForms, and that's called paint. It's the paint method. If we select our canvas panel and we click on the lightning bolt, these again are all of the different events that are associated with a panel. You'll notice here there is a paint method. So what we can do is we can either double click here or we can type our own name for this method. I'm going to go ahead and double click, and you'll notice that the form behind or I'm sorry, the code behind our winform opens up, and it creates a shell of a method for me called paint. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to override this method with some code that we're going to write instead of allowing .NET or our application to render it on its own. So we're going to basically tell it how we want this panel to look and what we want it to do whenever it's loaded. Um, Before we get into that though, let's do a couple other things. Let's declare a few variables that we're going to need to make this all happen. In order to draw lines using some of the graphics APIs within .NET, you need to have something called a pin object, and then that is exactly what it sounds like. And it accepts as an argument what color you want the pin to be. So we're going to draw some black lines, at least starting out. We also need a graphics object. For now, we're just going to initialize that to null. You'll see how we use that later. And let's declare some static variables that we can use as well. Namely, we want to have center x and center y declared. And what that's going to be, or what we're going to do with those, is we're going to store the center of our canvas, whatever that point is, an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Now, if the form is this size, then our x coordinate or y coordinate will be different than if the form is maximized, consuming the entire area of our screen, right? So that's going to be something that we're going to have to set dynamically. We also need, we'll also use, and you'll see how we use these again in a few minutes. Um, Start x and start y, um, because when you draw a line using the pin object, basically you have a starting point and an endpoint, and what the pin will do, or what the graphics API will do, is basically draw a line between those 2 points. So to draw a line, you essentially have to specify two specific points or XY coordinates. So we'll use those dynamically. Those will change each time we draw a line. We also need um, index and end y, right? Um, and let's use some other variables that we can capture to hold the angle that we're just initialize it to 0 for now. The length, and what else do we have on there? The angle, the length, the increment, and the number of lines. We'll call it my increment. Okay. And just for simplicity right now, we'll just initialize those all to 0. Okay, so now we need to start thinking about how we're going to paint this canvas with the input that we've gathered, okay? Now, um, we already have our method to override paint, which is cool. We also need an event handler for this button this is basically, we're going to provide input, we're going to hit go, it's going to draw something. That's kind of the premise here. So again, I can either select the object or the control, the button, come over here to click, and double click here, or type in the name of the method I want to use, or I can simply click here. Okay. And what I'm going to do is when we click here, I'm going to do a couple things, right? We want to, every time we click this button, we want to basically forget about whatever's been drawn, and we need to reset all of our values that we're going to use in maybe a separate function that will actually do the drawing for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go get the values from our form. Um, and so we called the length text box is called length, I believe, right? So this guy is called length. So I'm saying I want to get length.text and I want to store it in my variable called myLength. Now this is screaming at me right now because length.text is going to give me a string value. MyLength is something we declared as an integer value. So before we can store that value there, we have to convert it to a number, right? And the same holds true with the other ones, right? So my length, my increment, and my angle. And we want to do increment.text, angle.text, and that should do it for now, right? We also probably want to, every time we press go, figure out where our starting point is. Um, so let's do start x equals. Now, we don't want to think about the middle point of the entire winform, probably. I mean, I guess we could do it that way. But probably what we want to do is figure out where the middle point of this panel is, our canvas is. So canvas has a nice, or I'm sorry, a panel has a nice property called width and length. So if we're talking about x coordinates, we would get the width divided by 2. That should give us the center of our panel. And if we look at start y, or we want to start y, canvas dot height divided by 2 should give us the middle, right? Okay, so basically every time we push that go button, what's going to happen is we're going to update whatever these three variables with whatever is supplied by the user in these boxes or text boxes, and then we're going to calculate the middle of our canvas, essentially, what that point should be. One other thing we need to do now, the paint method gets called every time this component gets drawn or loaded or invalidated or refreshed. There's a lot of ways that you can force an event, a paint event, to fire. The easiest way is to either invalidate the control or to refresh the control. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to say canvas.refresh. And again, what that's going to do is that's going to basically wipe the slate clean here and then redraw or repaint according to however we tell it to paint, essentially. Okay. So right now we don't have anything magical happening yet. We can run this, we can hit go all day long. Nothing really happens yet because we haven't told it to draw anything. We haven't had the pen draw anything. So what we're going to do next is we are going to create a method that is going to do the drawing for us. Okay. Now, what we want to do first is we have to, every time this method is called, essentially, we want to provide our pen object a beginning point and an ending point so that it can draw the line. And just to kind of demonstrate how this kind of looks, I'll just come up with one that's kind of arbitrary, and maybe doesn't make the most sense, but we'll at least demonstrate that we can actually draw a line if we want to. So I'm going to create a new array called points. And I'm going to create two new point objects. And one is going to have the starting coordinates, which should be the middle of our um, screen. Oops, middle of our canvas. And then I'll say 100 points added to each, right? And something just occurred to me. So the first time we run this, our paint method will get called. The first time that when we just run it without hitting go, because this has to be rendered, so the paint method will get executed or the paint event will get fired. We don't actually define what start x and start y is until this point in the game, which is actually too late. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this same piece of code up here to our constructor right there. And that should hopefully allow us to have those values populated before we get to the paint method. The last thing I'm going to do, and again, this is, well, a couple more things. Last thing, one of the most important things to do is when that paint method gets, or event gets fired, we need to actually tell it to draw these lines, right? So I'm going to call my draw line method as soon as the paint method gets, or as soon as the paint event gets invoked. And then the very last thing to do inside of here so that we actually do draw the line, Remember we have that graphics object that we created up here. This is where we'll actually use that. And we're going to say G draw lines is a method that is provided with the graphics object. And we basically pass it the pin, which is basically going to control things like the color of the line, the weight of the line, and that sort of thing. And then we also want to pass it our array of points to draw. Now, when we do this, what we should see is the paint method or paint event should get fired, which would in turn call our draw line method. Um, and our draw line method will execute and will basically draw a line between these 2 points, right? Which should be the middle of our screen to, I guess it's going to be a downward angle, 100 plus 100 pixels on the x-axis and plus 100 pixels on the y-axis, and then we're going to draw those. So let's give that a shot. Let's see what we get. We get lots of lines. So paint probably got, oops, got executed several times. That's interesting, actually. Um, let's look at this for a second. Yeah, so I think paint is getting executed a number of times. That's what we're forgetting. I'm lying. Here we go. Anytime we create or we paint the canvas, we need to actually create the graphics objects for that panel, and I think that's why we are running into problems. So let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do a couple things actually I left off. Let's make the width of the pen, so the weight of the line equal to 1. Um, and then we have to initialize the graphics object, which we didn't do. So basically most components have a create graphics method that you can use. So in our case, we want to get just the canvas. We don't want to get the entire form. So let's get just the canvas, and we want to create the graphics object and store that in G. Now this should work a little bit more like we would think. So we specify that the width of the pen, the weight of the line, we want to be 1. We're initializing our graphics object, which we didn't do before. I think that's why we got that interesting um, drawing when we were done. And then we're going to draw the line, which basically says, here are some points, and I want to draw these points, and we should get something that we expect this time, hopefully. Yeah, that's a little more reasonable. Okay, so basically this is the center of this point right here is the center of our canvas. And then we added 100 pixels and 100 pixels, which gave us this point right here. And then essentially our pen drew the line between the two. If we change the width of the pen, you'll notice that the line gets thicker, right? As you might expect. We can also change the color of the pen. There's lots of things you can control with the pen to make it a little more interesting. For now, we'll leave it 1. Okay. Now what we want to do though is we want to basically draw a line. Actually, we want to draw this quantity of lines, whatever specified here, and we need to make this angle turn every time we draw a line, and this is our length. So we need to start considering some of the input that the user is providing, right? So nothing really needs to change inside of our paint method. We can change, or we get the length. All this happens when we click the button. Um, let's see about this now. Probably what we could do is we could actually get these inside of our paint method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these so we don't have to recode this twice. But essentially, I'm going to put those right up here. So whenever the paint method gets invoked, whether it's because we press the go button or it's because we're simply launching the application and it has to be rendered the first time, we'll always make sure that we've acquired these values, okay? Is that going to work though? Yeah, that should work. No, we don't want to do that. I'm lying. Because if we do that, that's going to change our values every time, and we'll not be able to get them back. All right. Sorry, bear with me. I'm thinking through this a little bit. All right. Let's try this now. Let's go ahead and we can get the angle and the length. That's fine. Whenever we draw the line, right? Because we need to potentially increment that and change that. Okay. So what I'm going to say is my angle equals my angle, because we're constantly going to be adding to the angle, because we're constantly going to be drawing a new line and wanting to pivot on that angle. Um, equals, again, back to this same value. Oops. And again, we have to convert it to an integer so that we can then do the math with it, right? And I'm going to do the same thing with the length, because the length is going to change every time we draw a line because of the increments that we're going to do. Increment dot text. That's right. Okay. Okay, yeah. So next, what we want to do is a little bit of math, right? And this is where it can get a little fuzzy for a lot of people, right? If you're not up on your calculating coordinates based on angle and vector length and that sort of thing, we're going to break out the good old algebra days of cosine and sine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign these new points values, right? So our endpoint is going to be an integer where we're going to take start x, which is our starting point. Oops. And we're going to add it to the cosine of the angle, right? And then we're going to multiply that times the length. Now, we're going to do basically the same thing for the y coordinate, except for instead of cosine, we're going to use sine. And we're going to add that to y angle. Make sure that's right. Sine, cosine, yep. Now, one thing that's interesting about this cosine method is it actually takes radians as an argument. So we're trying to pass it an angle value where this is looking for radians. So there's a great conversion. Don't worry, I had to look it up too because I wasn't sure what it is. But let me type it in. There. This will essentially convert our angle to radians so that we get the expected outcome, right? Um, and then what we need to do is we're always going to be start x and start y is going to be our first point. And what we need to change here is this should be our endpoint, right? End x and end y. Okay. And then after each point is drawn, essentially, if we draw a line from here to here, our next beginning point should be here, and then we should go to here, or whatever the angle dictates. So we'll also do one more thing where we assign start x to end x, right? So that we pick up where we left off. Start y equals end y. Now, just as I said, while on the first line, this, if we go from here to here, this would be our endpoint. But on the next line we draw, this would be our start point, and then we would go to our next endpoint. So that's why we're doing this piece right here. Okay. After that, I think we can draw the lines. I think the last thing we're missing really is simply to wrap our draw line method call in the number of um, lines that we want to draw. So according to what the user input. So I'm going to start just with a for loop. And as long as we are less than, we're going to parse it again. Or actually, do we have it already up here? We do. Num lines. Do we get that updated? Let's just do it here. Parse num lines dot text. Oops. There we go. Leaving stuff out and getting syntax all wrong. That should be outside. All right. Why don't you like this? Did we get that wrong? Number of lines, sorry. Number of lines. Dot text. Okay. And you know what I'm going to do? I'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and I'm going to reset this just to 1 for now. just so we can see what's going on, make it really clear. I'm going to change this angle to 90. Everybody's good with dealing with those angles. I'll make this line length, let's make it 50. And then the increment, that can be 1, I suppose. That's fine. All right, so let's take a look at how this, take a look and see how this goes. Um, Essentially, what we expect to happen the first time it draws, because of those settings that I just applied, we should see, I think, one line that's just just horizontal straight across. It should be black, should have a length of 50, and that should be it. So let's see what we get. We got a dot. um, let's see if we make that. 50 seems like it should be long enough, unless I'm forgetting something. Same thing, still just a dot. Let me see what I'm missing here. Okay, so we initialize start X and start Y. When paint gets called, we dictate the pin, we create the graphics object, and then we're saying we're going to loop the number of lines, which right now is just 1. And then what we want to do is we want to draw the line. So we get the angle, we get the length, we defined end X and end Y. We create our points, which the first point should be start X and start Y. The next point should be end X and end Y. We then take start X and assign the value of end X, start Y, assign the value of end Y, and then we call the draw lines method, passing it the pin that we created and the points that we want to draw. That looks right. Our paint method. Oh, you know what? Do we ever assign a value to length? Yeah, we do, because we initialize that to 0. I think what we might need to do is add this back here. Let's add this here. Because that's what it is. We're starting at, we basically initialized that to 0, so we've only incremented by 1. So we never actually got the length value assigned. That's a mistake by me. So let's do this here. I think this will solve our problem. Yeah, there we go. So we get a straight line. Now if we change this to 2, we should see another line. If we change it to 3, you'll see that that gets added. 4, we got our square, right? So you see what's going on here. Every time that we draw a line, we're incrementing the length of the line by 1. Our angle is 90, and the length of the line is starting at 100 pixels. Now, it's a little bit imperfect because, as you can imagine, when we start looking at sine and cosine, we start dealing in decimal values. But when we're talking about grid coordinates on a panel, we're dealing in integers, so it's going to do the rounding for us. But let's, now that we've done this, we can kind of start tweaking with it or playing with this a little bit and seeing what kind of interesting things we can come up with. So let's draw 100 lines, and let's say, I don't know, 74 degrees. Let's make the length, we'll start at 10, or I'm sorry, 5, and then every time we draw a line, we'll increment by 1, and let's see what that looks like. So a nice, cool little pattern there. If we make this 1,000, see what we get. Get a different drawing or continuation of the same drawing. If we back this guy back down to 100, and maybe we make the increment 3, we should see a little more space, right? If you tweak the angles, get different drawings. But you get the idea. I mean, it's just a kind of a cool little fun app to get you into messing with graphics objects and coming up with some cool designs, some fun patterns. You could do the same thing with fractals, would be another good way to take this. Let's do, I don't know, I'm just playing now. Nice and tight. If we expand this and we hit go, um, you'll notice that everything kind of stays proportional. We recalculated the beginning of the screen or the middle of the screen according to the size of the window. Um, but it doesn't actually refresh, or that paint method doesn't get called when we simply resize the form. Um, so anyways, if we wanted to do maybe one more thing just to make it fun, maybe we could add some color in here, do some random color, or maybe change the color of the line. Every line that's drawn, make it a different color. So let's do that. And that would probably need to be inside of our draw line method, right? Because this is going to get called every time we want to draw a line. So I'm going to create a random number generator. And we'll use this to come up with some RGB colors that we can then use to change the pen color. So my pen is our writing utensil. um, and we're going to do color from, what do we want to do? We're going to do ARGB. And we want to say random gen.next, where we're going from 0 to 255. I'm going to copy this guy over 3 more times or 2 more times. Is that right? Yeah, okay. So simply adding those 2 lines, now every time we draw a line, this will calculate some random color, and that will become the color of the pen. So let's run this guy now and see what we get. You'll see right there it's green. You know what, before we do that, let's go back in here real quick and let's just update these values one more time. So let's do 500, I don't know, 74 seemed like it was a cool, and we'll start with 5 maybe. There we go. All right, let's see what we get. And there we go. Different color every time, right? Start at 2. Anyways, you get the idea. But just a fun little application that you can use to start messing around with the graphics objects that are available to you inside WinForms and using C#.net. So give it a try, and hopefully you'll have fun trying to figure this one out. Take care.